Well, listen, we want to just say, to start off, I'm going to do a little intro for you. And
What are you doing? What's the general structure?
we're going to talk about your whole life in about 20 seconds. But no, I'm just joking, of course. But
What's your framework?
we're attempting to find out about one of the greatest minds in America, and we're looking at him right here. And one of the things that we're just so proud of is we've been following you. Little did we know of what a mark you would make on our country, but back in the 80s or 70s, we came up with this little. They had a magazine called Covert Action, which I also was, along with my Soldier of Fortune magazine, I also subscribed to your magazine to find out what was going on in the world, and from that point of view. At any rate, first of all, I'm going to say a few things, and then if there's anything that's not exactly
part of a bigger project. What's the bigger project?
The bigger project here, is, as I say, is we're going to just talk about variety of issues, Vietnam and.
No. I mean, is our interview part of the bigger project?
No, it's a one of a kind. It's a one only. There's not going to be anything that's going to step in the way there.
And what do you plan to do with it?
It'll be on the web,
I see.
24/7. There's no money involved. I'm sorry to say we don't have distribution yet. So this is going to be another labor of love for us to the people of the world.
You've been doing things like this for a while?
We've been doing things like this for about 7 years. And the cutting edge is designed to reach, be a part of media that no one covers, that no one finds out about. Noam Chomsky is written up and seen on television, but you get a 20-second soundbite. You never get the context of what you're saying. Or you're in a specific auditorium giving a specific speech about a specific item for hours. We don't do any of that. What we attempt to do is to focus it and to try to reach down and say, here's a man that's got 30 degrees, and if we're not correct now in what we're saying here, you have 30 honorary degrees from all over the world for your work in linguistics. You have over 100, we don't even know how many books that you've written since 1967, or was it before that? So you're the most well thought of man. The only thing I don't think, have you won the Nobel Prize for anything?
Kyoto Prize, which is the Japanese counterpart.
Same thing. Yeah.
Sort of. It's not as famous, but it's the Japanese effort, and it's broader. So this was basic science.
Now you're talking about linguistics, and I'd like to just follow that a little further. How many languages do you speak?
One, sort of.
But you've done this incredible study and set groundbreaking rules for linguistic philosophy and for computer science and a whole raft of other issues, right?
Yeah, but it's theoretical work. It's not about. I mean, I don't. Of course, I use material from particular languages, like the last guy who was here did a dissertation on Dutch and Hungarian. So,
right, Dutch and Hungarian.
But it's kind of like a theoretical physicist using material from experimental physicists.
Well, you got started. A couple of things that we couldn't find out about you, so I'm going to ask you. Sure. The first one is, did you ever serve any time in the service of our country in the armed forces?
No, and I have no idea why. I was 1A, but they never called me.
Yeah, you seem to be at the right age for Korea.
That was Korea, and I went through, I forget what you call it now. It was
the draft.
Yeah, I was classified 1A. Actually, what actually happened is I didn't have a PhD, and I really hadn't intended to get one, but I asked the draft board for a 6-week extension. It was April 1st, so that I just finished up a PhD, and they granted me the 6-week extension, and I applied. I wasn't even registered, and sort of quickly faked my way through a PhD, and then I never heard from them again. I didn't contact them.
Of course not. Now, let me ask you this. You started being on the radar screen of America in a big way back in the Vietnam era, which is about 67. What was the name of the first book you wrote? Do you remember?
Well, the first book by a real publisher was American Power and the New Mandarins, which was mostly a collection of articles. It was a collection of articles almost entirely from the 60s.
From the 60s, yeah. Now, you were one of the big voices. Now, in modern days, I hate to jump that far. That's a huge jump, but you know, you're considered the darling of the left in one regard. You're considered. I mean, the people have called you everything. Good. I mean, from the very best to the very worst. But there's no doubt that everyone has an opinion about Noam Chomsky. They really do. And we had in our study of you, we found a couple of people that had particular, really pointed areas about you. And one of them was a guy by the name of David Horowitz, who wrote about the 101 most dangerous professors in America. And I don't know which number you were. I couldn't find that.
Pretty high, I'm sure.
You were pretty high up on the list of people that was dangerous. And then there was a guy also by the name of Kahn that wrote. I have that somewhere, but Cohn, Warner Kahn or something like that.
Warner Kahn.
Yes, and he's a famous guy that wrote about how you were really such anti-Semitic and a naysayer to the, you know, and all these other things. So we got all these great.
Well,
I mean,
if you really do a Google search, you'll get a sample of the letter, the collection I get every night. Every night, I'm sure to get at least letters from at least 4 industries. One of them claims I want to kill all the Jews. The second claims I'm a Mossad agent. The third claims I'm anti-American. The fourth claims I'm a CIA agent. And they're guaranteed every night.
No, that's the part of this story. Nice balance. Let's do a little fallback position. A couple of things to clear up because you got involved in, and I think we need. This is an area no one's ever really. I don't think they've asked you, but we're trying to be innovative here, Dr. Chomsky. We don't want to be the same old stuff for you. Back in the Vietnam era, when this was started, they had, of course, we had the Watergate situation. That came later, but there was always this doubt. You've never doubted picking on the Republicans, the Democrats, whoever was in office. It seems like you're always, really saying something not too positive, even about JFK or about Lyndon Baines Johnson or about Nixon.
There were some positive things. In fact, in all of them, mainly LBJ, who pushed through some significant domestic measures.
But not in foreign policy.
No, in foreign policy, the differences are pretty slight. Johnson didn't really initiate much in the way of foreign policy. He was kind of, in Vietnam, he was kind of trapped by what was happening. I don't think he had to pursue it the way he did, but it was already underway. I mean, the invasion, it's not the way it's discussed here, but the fact of the matter is that the invasion of South Vietnam, which was the main part of the war, was in 1962. That's Kennedy. And contrary to a lot of mythology, Kennedy remained a hawk. To the day of the assassination, there's a lot of...
He was afraid of those dominoes falling, huh?
Well, see, the domino theory has 2 versions. One of them is intended for the public, and it's ridiculous, and it keeps being refuted, and people say, oh yeah, that was a terrible mistake. The other version is very sensible, and it keeps being pursued all the time. The version for the public is, pick your domino. Ho Chi Minh, let's say, is going to get into a canoe and, land in California and rape your grandmother or something. That's a caricature of the version for the public. And the name can change. Like now it's Chavez, sometimes somebody else. And that continually gets refuted, and people say, oh yes, we exaggerated, mistake, and so on. But there's a sensible version of the domino theory, which never gets refuted because it's correct. And that's the one that actually applies in intervention after intervention. What it claims is, with some plausibility, that if there is successful independent development in some corner of the world, and the poor countries are more dangerous than the rich countries in this respect, but if it succeeds somewhere, let's say Grenada or Laos or any crazy place you think of, others who have similar problems nearby are going to raise questions about why not us. And then, to use Henry Kissinger's terminology, the virus spreads contagion elsewhere.
Would you say that was related to something like Mozambique? Because Mozambique was supposed to be this great socialist, independent nation that was going to turn everything around and make it beautiful for everyone. And
same in case after case, and we never know, because every one of them, almost, well, I think invariably, gets attacked and destroyed.
now, is this related also to Allende in Argentina? Was it a similar situation there?
Allende, where Kissinger used the phrase virus that will spread contagion elsewhere, and he was afraid it would spread contagion as far as southern Europe, not because Chilean armies were going to land in Rome, but because the prospect of a social democratic government operating through parliamentary means and carrying out independent programs contrary to the wishes of the United States might influence southern Europe. At that point, the danger, what they regarded as the danger, was what was called Euro-communism. That was the former communist parties, which were becoming sort of social democratic. And it's kind of interesting that Brezhnev was just as worried about them as Kissinger.
They're sort of, in other words, these are countries that are operating independently without any help from either the United States or the USSR at that point.
They will, you can drive them into support from the USSR. Most of them don't want it. But in case after case, the U.S. has driven the states it wanted to undermine into the hands of the Russians, and then used that as a pretext for intensifying the attack.
This is a thought that I've been wondering about, that I know that you might be able to answer. Our concept is to get cheap labor, don't have any environmental concerns, and build products out of our country. That's the way we make the products that are the cheapest thing we can find at Walmart, is because we can do this.
That's the current version.
That's the current version.
Broader version. And
Okay.
That's not unique to the United States. Every substantial great power has had similar views, and the United States happens to be a world dominant power, so it's overwhelming.
So
the idea is to have an international order which is open to penetration and control by domestic sources of power. Now, it's not a secret who the domestic sources of power are in the United States. U.S.-based international corporations. They should have access to the resources and markets and investment opportunities and so on.
Okay, let's stop there and help me out here. You've mentioned several times energy companies. You've mentioned I think there's 4 groups that you have identified in the United States that you consider the power brokers of these international corporations.
Called they're called the Seven Sisters. I think most of them now are U.S. based.
Okay, but those you call them the Seven Sisters, and
Well, that's not what I call them. That's what they're called by everyone in the literature.
Oh, okay.
These are the big concentrations of. By now they're kind of more diversified, but like Exxon, by now a lot of them become conglomerates.
Right.
Like ExxonMobil, Texaco, Chevron, and so on.
Those are just the energy companies. What about ADM and some of these other those kind of companies?
Well, they're not actually, in a sense, they're energy companies because high-tech agricultural production has enormous energy inputs.
Right.
That's one of the ways in which they get subsidized by you and me, the taxpayer, through state support. But but for them it's the same thing. They're agribusiness. Close enough.
So it's in their best interest to have control of different countries.
Well, they don't even want the control. They just want them to be open to U.S. penetration, and they want them to follow policies which will make it possible for them to exploit the markets, to invest, to gain resources, basically to do whatever they want in those countries. If it happens to be Walmart, it's to get cheap commodities to sell here. And yes, those are the dominant principles of imperial power.
Is that the reason why we went to Vietnam?
Well, we didn't care about Vietnam itself. I mean, Eisenhower made various rather foolish comments about the rubber and the tin of Indochina and so on, but that was just to stir up, some concern here. If Vietnam had fallen off the earth, the United States would have known the difference. But the problem was the virus effect. If they were concerned that Vietnam might undergo a course of independent development, which would be successful in terms that appeal to others who are bitterly oppressed and who face similar problems. So the virus might spread, of successful independent development might spread to Thailand, to the Philippines, might even spread to Indonesia, which was a real prize. In fact, Eisenhower.
Is this sort of I hate this gross analogy, but sort of like the mafia? You have a mafia don, and he's afraid that somebody's going to go out and do some business on their own.
Exactly. I mean,
So
it's very similar. The world is like the mafia. So suppose you're a mafia don and some small grocer somewhere doesn't pay his protection money. Well, you don't care about the money and you don't care about him, but you're not going to let him get away with it. In fact, you're not just going to send your goons to get the money. You're going to send your goons to beat him to a pulp so that everyone understands that this is not proper behavior. And if you try to do this, you're going to get in deep trouble. And that's not a bad analogy to international affairs. That's why the U.S. has been so intense on destroying things you wouldn't even know exist.
Was this covered in your book, Hegemony and Survival?
Yeah, it's covered there and in a lot of other books.
In a lot of other books,
but these are the dominant, one of the dominant themes of history, and they take different forms at different times. Like during the 19th century, it was literal conquest. Okay, now it's not literal conquest; it's subversion, subordination, and so on. And you find it right through the documentary record. They're pretty frank about it. So take, say, Cuba, which the United States has been terrorizing and trying to strangle since 1959. I mean, Cuba was invaded. It's the oldest issue in U.S. foreign policy. Back in the 1820s, Jefferson, Adams, others were trying to figure out how to gain control over Cuba. It was essential for our expansion and so on. Well, they couldn't do it at that time because there was a deterrent. The British Navy was too strong. That's why we didn't conquer Canada, though they tried several times. It was a deterrent, pretty much the same way the Russians were a deterrent in the 60s. But John Quincy Adams made an intelligent point. He said that if we wait, Cuba will fall into our hands like the way a ripe apple falls from the tree by the laws of political gravitation. What that meant was, and everyone understood it, that sooner or later over time, we will gain in power, the British will recede in power, and we'll be strong enough so there won't be any deterrent. And that's what happened through the 19th century. In 1898, Cuba was on the verge of liberating itself from Spain. The U.S. intervened in what is called here the liberation of Cuba, but what was in fact the prevention of the liberation of Cuba. And by now there's good scholarship on it and the facts are very clear. And the U.S. took it over and it became a virtual colony. And it remained so until 1959. Then it liberated itself. Within a few months, the U.S. had begun both paramilitary activities, sometimes bombing, and economic strangulation. And the reasons are explained in the documentary record, in the Kennedy and Johnson years particularly.
Well, but
and it's just like the mafia. What they say is Cuba, the problem is Cuba's successful defiance, that's the phrase that's used, of policies that go back 150 years.
Well, this is Dr. Chomsky. This is what I'm about to say to you. I mean, we had the the Louisiana Purchase, the Gadsden purchase. We had
literal conquest
and literal conquest. That's my point. My point is that this manifest destiny for the United States has been going on for how many years now? Since its founding.
Since 1608, when the first colonists landed.
So you're blaming it on the Pilgrims then?
I'm not blaming it on anyone. I'm just saying that they landed. They had a lot of them were religious fanatics.
Right.
They thought that the children of Israel coming to the Promised Land and killing the Amalekites and so on. Others just wanted possessions, expansion. An awful lot of them were indentured servants or criminals
Right.
who were just sent away. In Australia, it was the great majority.
Well, we caught you on
and since then, you just go on.
we caught you on one issue that we're looking at the critique of. It's great because I don't think we've ever seen anyone get as many pages of the critique of Noam Chomsky. I mean, there's a whole raft of people that are all standing in line to critique you. And what was hilarious was that they said, well, you have these glowing terms, blah, blah, and that you take things out of context and all the typical arguments that you see every day. But the one thing that I do want to bring to your attention that might be a thought here is there was a man by the name of Gaddis that currently,
Gaddis.
yes, and that's a philosopher.
He's a historian.
Historian.
Very
right. That used,
historian.
and I'm bringing it up to modern days now because they used this preemptive strike mentality based on his philosophy. Is that correct, or on his?
I wouldn't say philosophy. I mean, he's a good historian.
On his reporting of the facts of John
One of
Adams.
the most highly regarded historians. Actually, I write about him in Failed States. He wrote the first and, in fact, only scholarly book on the roots of the Bush Doctrine,
Right.
which he basically approves of. He has qualifications about how they're implementing it and so on. He says basically, in fact, he was invited to the White House and so on. And he's a highly regarded historian, and insofar as he covers the history, he's accurate. He just leaves out a huge amount.
Well, there's the clarity here we're trying to draw is that he says that in his history that the reason why we can do preemptive strike is because of Andrew Jackson. Is that correct?
And John Quincy Adams.
And John Quincy Adams, who said,
his
that this is, it goes right back to what you were just talking about, this virus of contagion of free entities. And the reason why it drew our attention, believe it or not, is because I happened to spend a little time in 2 years citizen soldier in the Army, and when I did, I was with the 2nd Armored Cav. Well, there happened to be this article related to that about the Seminole Indians. Well, since I've studied about the 2nd Armored Cav, I found out that the worst debacle in American history was the founding of the 2nd Armored Cav was in 1820, and we sent all of these American soldiers down to the swamps of the Seminole Nation and Osceola, and they just got killed. I mean, whether it was disease or whatever it is, it was the worst failure of an American fighting force in history. And so, you characterize it as if we went down there and killed the Indians. Well, the truth of that particular item was that, and actually we really lost that, but they kept saying that we were going to win.
Well, what you described I didn't know, but the fact is that the Seminoles were described as runaway slaves and lawless.
Oh, they were characterized in the worst way.
And they were essentially wiped out. The ones who weren't wiped out in the first Seminole War were driven out later. And that's why we had Florida.
All right, we're going to agree to disagree on that issue, but other than that, we couldn't find anything that we could argue with.
Florida's ours. It's not the Seminoles.
Yeah.
And the Seminoles are gone. They remain in the national consciousness as the mascot of the football team.
There'll be somebody from Florida State that will come on, that will undoubtedly write a letter to you now and discuss this in greater detail.
Talk about it at Florida State. I mean, it's one of the most vicious campaigns in history. Gaddis refers to it,
right?
But he refers to it not as gaining resources. He refers to it as security. We had to have security, and his principle is that expansion is the path to security. And then he says, well, that goes all the way through American history.
Right.
It goes right to the Bush Doctrine. So we have to expand to be secure. Until we own everything, probably including Mars, we're not going to be secure. Well, okay, that's a theory. I mean, a lot of antecedents who we might not like to remember.
Right.
But he's basically correct in saying that that has been the guiding principle, but security had zero to do with it. I mean, he claims the British were threatening us. That's total nonsense. The British were trying to make peace with the United States at the time, in fact, making all kind of concessions. Even when the U.S. Kidnapped a couple of British citizens and I think killed them, they didn't do anything about it. So there was no security issue.
Right.
It was just, the colonists wanted Florida.
We got it.
Yeah, we got it.
Was that the Gadsden Purchase?
No, that was the Seminole War.
But I'm saying, though, how did we get Florida, all of Florida? What was it?
Well, it was part, Florida was a big area.
Sure.
Part of it came along in the Louisiana Purchase. But the part that Andrew Jackson invaded and conquered with John Quincy Adams' support is what we now call Florida. That was conquered in a brutal, vicious war. There's very good historical scholarship on that. Actually, it's interesting that Gaddis refers to it, but does not include what it says in Failed States.
Right.
It just went through what the scholarship actually says. And it was vicious and brutal. A real colonial war. They were massacred.
Well, I would just draw your attention to the history. You can pull it up on the web, like you said,
Yeah,
to
I'm sure
Google.
you're right.
In the
But that's
history of the
more-
Second Armored Cav, and you'll find
Yeah.
out that it was the worst failure of a military force in American history.
Maybe that particular event was.
Well, that
but
was
the
a
end-
two-year
fine,
campaign
but
to
the end
exterminate
result
those
was that
people.
The Seminoles were exterminated by an invasion, by aggression. And it's not unusual for an invading army to suffer tremendous casualties and defeats.
Yeah.
I mean, that happens.
Well, let's talk about those tremendous casualties we're serving ourselves up for right now. We're engaged in this conflict in Iraq, and we've one of the issues involved in this has been it was involved in Vietnam, it was involved in Korea, it was involved in every conflict we've been into. It's called rules of engagement. And right now we have some very stiff rules of engagement on our troops in Iraq. And so what are we doing there, and what should we be doing there?
Well, the invasion of Iraq was simply a criminal act. That was the Nuremberg Tribunal hanged the German leaders for a series of crimes, among them preemptive war. Like the German foreign minister was hanged, and one of the major charges against him was that he supported Germany's preemptive strike against Norway, which had military justification. They were concerned that the British might invade from Norway. So they carried out a preemptive strike against Norway, and he was hanged. The tribunal determined, its exact words were something like this, that aggression is the supreme international crime, which encompasses within it all of the evil that follows. Okay, so everything that follows after the aggression is the responsibility of the aggressors, everything.
Right.
In Iraq, that means everything. It means Abu Ghraib, Fallujah, killings of American soldiers.
Doesn't that really relate to the guy that loses the war always suffers the pain of whatever was done?
That's right. Laws are applied to the losers.
Right.
Now, the American justice, the prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, made some very eloquent declarations at the time of the tribunal. I quote them in Failed States. He said, "We are handing the defendants here a poisoned chalice, and if we sip from it, we must suffer the same fate. If the Nuremberg Tribunal is to be anything but victor's justice, we have to apply to ourselves the same principles we're applying to them." Okay, I think that was wise words. Never happened, of course, because exactly as you say, it's the defeated who pay.
Well, because you mentioned so many times, you mentioned Dresden as a good example of America, or no, I don't know what Allied forces that bombed a so-called civilian site that had no real military process. And you've also picked on the fact that we had to bomb, where we did bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima with the atomic weapons in World War II.
Personally, my own feeling was that the U.S. was justified in entering the war. In fact, as a child, I thought it should have entered much earlier. In fact, if Hitler had been confronted in 1938, he never would have invaded anyone. The main problem was that the U.S. and Britain particularly, but the U.S. as well, really sort of tolerated him. They didn't think he was that bad. So as I was a child, but my feeling was that there should have been intervention to prevent Nazism. During the war, once the U.S. was attacked at Pearl Harbor, it finally got into the war. Much too late, in my opinion. But then I think it was a justified war of defense, not the way it was fought. A lot of the things about the way it was fought were not justified. But overall, You know, I think it's.
Well, they said they would say we would have saved the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima saved 1 million American lives.
That's mostly fabrication. It's unknown to be fabrication.
Okay.
But, and in fact, it probably didn't even end the war. What ended the war, according to the best available scholarship now, is the Russian entry into that convinced the Japanese military that they didn't have a chance. They were hoping that maybe the Russians would stay out and they could work out some sort of a deal. When the Russians nevertheless invaded, they figured it was over and they surrendered. But apart from particular incidents, overall, I think it was legitimate for the United States to be involved in the war. That had nothing to do with the particular incidents. However, that's a very different story from Iraq. In Iraq, we are the aggressors, not in the Second World War. We weren't the aggressors. I mean, we occupied Europe and Japan, and you can argue about the way it was done, but it was in response to aggression.
Well, tie that in for me, because we've always, this is really, if you can solve this question, we're going to make a tremendous thing. The Germans in World War II always said, I'm not a Nazi, I'm just a German, and this guy, bad guy, Hitler, he's running things, and so what could we do? We could just have to stand here. Well, essentially, that's what they're saying in Iraq. They're saying Saddam Hussein did all these bad things, and don't blame us, we're not the bad guys. But now it's...
Sorry, we supported Saddam Hussein right through his worst crimes.
But when you say we, I always wonder about
the United States government.
Understood, but who in the United States government?
Ronald Reagan, Donald Rumsfeld. In fact, let's be precise about this.
Right.
Saddam Hussein was condemned for crimes he committed in 1982, killed a couple hundred people. 1982 is a very important year in U.S.-Iraqi relations. 1982 is the year in which Ronald Reagan took Iraq off the list of states supporting terrorism so that the U.S. could start supplying its friend Saddam Hussein with substantial aid, including military aid, including means to develop.
Because they were in a war with Iran.
That was the claim at the time, and we know that was false, and I'll explain why.
All right.
But it doesn't matter for this purpose. The U.S. supported Saddam. Donald Rumsfeld was sent as the emissary, special emissary, to firm up the agreement. It continued right through the war with Iran, right through Saddam's worst atrocities, gassing the Kurds, everything else. He was continued to supply them, continued after the war with Iran was over. So the supplies, the military supplies and so on, George Bush #1 explained why. He said it's our responsibility to U.S. exporters, that's a big market, and furthermore Saddam is contributing to the stability of the region. In 1989, long after the war with Iran, the first Bush administration invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for special training in how to develop nuclear weapons. Goes on practically in the early 1990, Bush sent, April I think, sent a high-level senatorial delegation headed by Bob Dole with Alan Simpson and others. The transcripts to meet Saddam, the transcripts are available.
Sure.
And they're embarrassing, so nobody talks about them. They were praising Saddam. They were conveying the president's good wishes to him. They were telling Saddam not to worry about the critical reports that he sometimes hears from the American press. We just can't shut those guys up, and so on. That was a couple of months before the invasion of Kuwait. Support went on up to the invasion, and to tell the truth, it went on after the invasion. We won't go into that. So it wasn't the invasion. It was just that Saddam was considered one of the good guys. In fact, Saddam was allowed to do something that almost nobody can get away with. In fact, Israel's the only other country that's gotten away with it. Saddam was permitted to attack a U.S. ship, USS Stark, killing several dozen sailors with Exocet missiles, and to get away with a letter of apology. The only other country that's done anything like that is Israel's attack on the Liberty.
I know, but now your detractors would tell you this, though. They would say that right at that moment, from 1982 forward, there was a war with Iran. The Iranians had already captured our embassy people and held them for 185 days. It was a mess. We were a mess in the region completely. At that point in time, we'd egg all over our face anyway. So it was lovely to have Saddam be a surrogate for the United States and fight that war with Iran so that we didn't have to get to bloody our hands.
First of all, we are the aggressors against Iran, not the other way around. In U.S.-Iran relations, there is one event in history, the one you mentioned, the hostages, not in Iranian history. In Iranian history, it goes back to 1953, when the Eisenhower administration joined with the British in overthrowing the parliamentary government
Correct.
of Iran, because they were trying to control their own oil,
Yeah.
and installed a
Shah.
brutal and vicious tyrant, the
Of course,
Shah,
yeah.
who had one of the worst human rights records in the world.
You bet.
And was carrying out all kinds of
No doubt.
atrocities.
No
U.S.
doubt.
supported him, was just fine, up until the day when he was finally overthrown.
This has
At
been
that-
your. This
hold on a
is.
second.
Well, I'm sorry.
That's, at that point, yes, they took hostages, undoubtedly a crime, but in context, minimal. The U.S. then chose to, you're right, to punish Iran for overthrowing the Shah. They're not allowed to do that. And therefore supported Saddam Hussein right through his worst atrocities. And after the war ended, crucially, after the war ended, the same support continued.
He was a friend of ours.
And in fact, as I say, he was allowed to get away with things that practically nobody can get away with. And they explained why.
Yeah.
He's a force for stability in the region and so on. In fact, if you want to know how bad it was, after the invasion of Kuwait and the U.S. first Gulf War, Saddam, there was an uprising, Shiite uprising, which probably would have overthrown him.
Right.
There were rebelling Iraqi generals. They didn't ask for help. They just asked us to keep Saddam from destroying them.
Right.
The Bush administration refused. Bush and Powell wouldn't do that. They wanted Saddam to destroy them. At least that's the way the facts look.
Right.
They would not. They claimed that they were fooled by Saddam, like they didn't tell him not to use military helicopters and tanks and so on, and he therefore did it, fooling the poor Joint Chiefs of Staff who couldn't have figured that out.
Yeah.
But what he did was huge massacre against the Shiites, crushed the rebellion. U.S. stood by quietly. It controlled the whole area, of course. And it was explained.
This is during the Clinton administration, right?
This is George Bush #1.
Oh, okay,
This
George
is
Bush. yeah.
1991.
Okay.
You look at the New York Times, it's well explained accurately. Alan Cowell is still the Middle East reporter, was then the main Middle East correspondent. What he pointed out is, accurately, he said, it's kind of ugly what they're doing, killing these thousands of people, but he said there's a consensus among the U.S. and its allies, meaning Britain and Saudi Arabia. There's a consensus that Saddam offers more hope for the stability of the region than those who are trying to overthrow him. In other words, we'd rather have Saddam in power than have an independent Iraq.
And that was because of this, the Sunni connection, was
It's
it?
because of nothing. It's because we didn't want an independent Iraq.
Okay.
And that goes on right until this moment.
Is there a religious element to this war, though, we were
By
fighting?
now, there's a religious element that was largely created by the war. I mean, up until the second U.S. invasion, Sunni-Shiite relations were pretty close. There's a lot of intermarriage. In fact, both sides were saying the first couple of years of the invasion, there'll never be a conflict because we're too integrated. Yeah, by now, that's why the Nuremberg judgment correctly described aggression as the supreme international crime, which encompasses all the evil that follows. One of the evils that follows is this sectarian conflict. Right to this moment, we are refusing to permit an independent Iraq. Simply take a look. An invading army has the responsibility. I mean, we know what the opinion of the people of Iraq is. I mean, the U.S. government is constantly running polls. You can find them. They're available on the internet. They're published sometimes. What they show is that in Baghdad, the latest State Department poll, 2/3 of the population wants us out at once. And over all of Iraq, it even includes the Shiite area, the Kurdish areas, where there's no fighting, even throughout, practically, throughout all of Iraq, an overwhelming majority wants a timetable for withdrawal, firm timetable in a year or less.
Is it?
Bush says, with the support of the Democrats, and the support of Britain, and the support of Europe, that there will be no timetable for withdrawal. Doesn't matter what the Iraqis want.
Right.
We're going to do what we want. Now, there's a name for this. It's called bringing democracy to Iraq. That's the party line. No matter what the facts are, no matter how much there's a mountain of evidence refuting it, that remains the party line, and every article has to obediently repeat it. But at this very minute, as all the way through, goes back to 58, 63, and so on, the U.S. does not want to have an independent, sovereign Iraq, and there are good reasons for it.
Well, what they would argue, and I have to bring this argument up because otherwise somebody is going to write me and say, why didn't you ask Ron?
Sure.
There's what they call Fedayeen people that are coming across borders that because of the jihad called by a variety, if you watch Al Jazeera or whatever, it's a giant jihad location. So, it's like everybody come on down, we're all going to have jihad over here in Iraq. So all of these foreign fighters from Jordan and Syria and all these other countries come across the border. They go into these neighborhoods in Baghdad and they cause trouble. And the reason why the local Iraqis don't want to be there, don't want Americans to be there, is because it's an excuse for these foreign fighters to come in and blow them up. And that's what the argument would be, number one. And number two is that if you watched a documentary on PBS called The Lima Company, it was about a Marine detachment that went there. And they fought for over a year and the only time they ever had a fight with the real Iraqis was over a dog that one of the guys shot and killed the dog. But other than that, it was always foreign fighters they were fighting.
Well, if anyone who believes this shouldn't be asking me, they should be asking U.S. intelligence why they're lying. They should be asking the main strategic analysts like Andrew Kortesman why they're lying. Because what all of them are saying is, yeah, they're foreign fighters and they're a tiny percentage. And those foreign fighters, who they've analyzed in great detail, Andrew Kortesman is the Center for Strategic International Studies is the main specialist on it, but U.S. intelligence agrees. They are people who were instigated by the invasion of Iraq. They had no background record. So yes, there's a very small number of foreign fighters infiltrating, but I think the latest estimates were maybe 5, maybe 10% of the forces. They're U.S. fighting Iraqis. That's point number one. So the questioners are addressing the wrong person. They shouldn't be asking me.
So magic wand one, we just get out of there. We're gone. What happens?
Wait a second.
Okay.
That was point number one.
Okay.
Point number two is, it doesn't matter what my opinion is, or your opinion is, or George Bush's opinion is. What matters is what the victim's opinion is. That's what matters
Exactly.
when you carry out an aggression.
Sure.
So we can have our own opinions. We're entitled to have them and express them and so on. And their significance is zero, including my opinion. Just like the opinion of the Nazis was zero with regard to occupied France. They could very well have said, the Nazis, and did, that if they leave France, there's going to be a massacre, which indeed there was. The French started massacring collaborators.
Yeah, they did.
Probably tens of thousands. So yeah, that was right. That was not an argument, because it didn't matter what the Nazis thought. They're aggressors. They have to do what the French want, and what the Norwegians want, and what the Russians want.
Well,
and so on.
let's bridge that one issue, because you've touched on something that I've read about you several times, and they kept saying through the years, and I just want you you don't have to defend yourself with us. I'm just saying that I think you should broach the argument, and that is that you have been a defender of the Khmer Rouge, and supposedly that you were apologist for them and said that they didn't do anything really harmful.
Well, actually, one of the articles of mine that I know is probably the best I ever wrote is what I wrote about the Khmer Rouge, because there has been a huge literature trying to find some error in it, like some misplaced comma or something. Nobody has found one phrase that ought to be changed. If you can find one, let me know about it. I'll make sure to correct it.
Now, for the kids that have not grown up, the Khmer Rouge was aftermath of Vietnam and our departure, April of '75. We left Vietnam, and right after that, the Cambodia area was then taken over by Khmer Rouge.
What happened.
And then there was a killing field, supposedly.
You see, as far as you go, it's correct. It leaves out most of the story.
That's why I just wanted to get context there.
The context, which is very well known, although you won't read it in the newspapers, is that there was a massive U.S. bombing of Cambodia. There was just an article published by the leading scholar, Ben Kiernan, who's head of the Genocide Project in Yale and a specialist on Cambodia and one of the main critics of the Khmer Rouge, just published an article. Unfortunately, it's a small Canadian journal, I haven't seen it here, where he reviews recently released, not so recent, Clinton released U.S. documentation, which shows that we knew that the bombing was horrendous. He shows that the U.S. documentation shows it was 5 times as high as was reported. And during that period, the Khmer Rouge went from essentially nothing, a couple of thousand people no one knew anything about, to an army of 200,000, which was basically organized by the mob.
I remember this, yeah.
And well,
I might have even read the
you
articles he
didn't-
wrote.
I'm sure you didn't read this, or
Okay.
maybe you did. It's pretty
Yeah.
obscure. It's in the Walrus. I mean, the basic story was known. He shows it was far worse than what was known. Finally, when the U.S. finally pulled out, the Khmer Rouge came in and carried out a big massacre. Now, getting back to what I wrote about it, I wrote exactly that. And in fact, the only thing I didn't know is how terrible the American bombing was.
Yeah.
But with regard to the Khmer Rouge, what I wrote and will say right now is, sure, it was a terrible massacre. We should tell the truth about it instead of lying about it. We should tell the truth instead of making up fantasies because it's useful for American propaganda.
Let's connect the dots on that. We
Excuse me.
bombed. Oh,
May
I'm
I
sorry.
continue?
Sorry.
I and my co-author, Edward Herman, are probably the only ones, at least that I remember, who actually quoted what U.S. intelligence was saying. I mean, U.S. intelligence had State Department intelligence, knew more about what was going on in Cambodia than anyone. So yeah, we quoted their estimates and said this is probably what's happening. And the things that are appearing in the press and books and so on are mostly fabrications. And they're known to be fabrications. So don't make fabrications, tell the truth, which is bad enough, and give the best estimates you can. Now, there are, if anyone can find a single error or misleading statement in what we wrote, we're glad to see it. But what was hated was we said you should tell the truth, and that can't be tolerated. Here was a wonderful propaganda weapon. Finally, our enemies committed a huge atrocity. Oh, lovely, let's scream and yell about it. Fine. Notice that nobody had any suggestions as to what to do about it. And in fact, one of the things in our book where we discussed this in depth, we compared the reaction to the Khmer Rouge atrocities with the reaction to the Indonesian atrocities in East Timor at the very same time, which were comparable. They may have killed maybe a quarter of the population. It's probably about as close to genocide as anything in modern history. That we could do something about. We could stop it instantly because they were doing it with our support and authorization. Cambodia, same place, same region, same time. Couldn't do a thing about it. Nobody had a proposal.
Before we leave you, we got to go. You've got a schedule.
That was the content of the book. And
I just got
that nobody talks about the Timor side because that is something that is on our.
Everybody will now. I just got to get this little wrap up going here because they want you. Yeah, and that is, what's your last book? Just give us what's the last one that you've written. You remember?
Perilous Powers, it's called.
It's Perilous Power. This one here with.
Gil Ashgar.
Yeah, so just go hold that up there, and we'll give you a quick plug. Yeah, raise it up a little. That's it, not in front of your face. That's perfect. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Dr. Chomsky. Listen, God bless you, sir. Thank you so much for sharing some time with you. And we obviously we could speak to you for hours and hours and hours. And thanks so much for being on the cutting edge.